Hey there Luma, this beauty is the jute stitch pattern and I'm Denise from lumahat.com. So happy to bring you this one. It is just a perfect stitch whether you use a chunky yarn, a lightweight yarn, any variation of the knit stitch that you want. And what I like the best is it's done with just 2 stitches over 2 rows. And the reverse side, although it's not completely reversible, right, you see how different it looks whether you use chunky or worsted weight yarn. You see that the stitch pattern looks amazing on both sides. Again, very different, but still both look great. As always, I want to remind you that this is a stitch pattern only video, and so I won't be discussing the cast on or cast off, but I'll give you a link in the description to a video that does. All right, without any further ado, we're going to row 1 where it's a purl 1, knit 1, in other words, the rib stitch. All right, for my sample swatch, I did start with a knit stitch that's not part of the pattern and then repeated the pattern, and at the end ended with a purl and knit, also not part of the pattern. So to start the pattern, we're going to start with a purl stitch. So put your working yarn under the existing loop, scoop up to create a new loop, take the old loop off, put the new one on, and pull. For the knit stitch, put the working yarn over the existing loop and knit off. For this particular one, I'm using a U version of the knit stitch. You can use a true, a flat, or the U-wrap like I did. If you want to do the E-wrap, you either have to use a small gauge loom or you can use the chunky, and I'll show you that next. All right, so that was row 1. You do a purl stitch and a knit stitch, purl, knit, all the way to the end of your row. And I would suggest ending with a purl. That's your +1, which looks way better. All right, for row 2, we're going to do a slip 1 with yarn in front and a purl 1. Way easier than it sounds. All right, remember that I have those 2 stitches on the other end where you're doing flat. They're not part of your pattern, and we're going to go to that slip with 1 in front. So let me show you this one real quick first and then real slow. So take the working yarn, put it under the existing loop, scoop up to create a new loop, and take that new loop and put it behind your peg, pull on the working yarn, and it'll drop the working yarn behind the peg. Now here I'm going to show you the difference when you're doing that purl. You're going to scoop up to create a new loop. You're going to take the old loop off and put the new loop on. When you work your slip with the yarn in front, right, this one right here, it takes that working yarn, that loop, that new loop, and it drops it right here in front of the fabric so you can see it. Very different from the purl in that case, right? So here we are. Let me show you again that slip with yarn in front, scoop up and create a new loop. That new loop, you take it behind the peg and then pull on the yarn so that that working yarn, that loop, can drop behind the peg. All right, for the purl, you're going to scoop up, same thing, you're creating a new loop, but this time you're going to take the old loop off and put the new loop on the peg. So the new loop is on the peg when you're doing the purl. When you're doing the slip, you can just take the old loop off and then put the working yarn behind. That's a different way of doing that stitch, always with the stitch falling behind that peg so that it is in front of the fabric. And let me show you again. You can just take the old loop off and take the working yarn and just put it behind the peg and put the loop back on. There's more than one way of doing that slip 1 with yarn in front. I prefer the one that looks like a purl because it's much easier. Okay, if you want to do it with an E-wrap with chunky, for the E-wrap peg version, you're doing the same knit 1, purl 1, right? But when you do the knit 1, you can completely wrap the peg, and that will give you an E-wrap, which a lot of you guys are fond of. But with a large gauge loom, that's only going to look good if you use chunky yarn. If you want to use this E-wrap version of the knit stitch, and you don't want to use a chunky yarn, then you need to use a small gauge loom. Okay, that's your knit 1 that's your purl one knit one using the eWrap. Okay, and for me, I do eWraps and I go back later and knit them off when I'm doing a rib stitch, which is basically a knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. Row 2 is exactly the same, no matter what version of the loom, no matter what weight of the yarn. Row 2 is a slip one, purl one, period. All right, that's it. That is the pattern. One row of purl one, knit one. Row 2 is a slip one, purl one. That easy, guys. Now that was the flat version. If you want to see the in the round version, get the written pattern. It's at lumahat.store. It includes the pattern and the chart. Thanks so much for watching. Come back and loom knit with me again. Love you much.